Well, our first story today is probably one of the funniest stories I've seen in a long time, because this must honestly feel like the Ides of March for Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. LGBT activists are actually calling on Justin Trudeau to resign and to turn the Liberal Party and 24 Sussex over to someone else because he may well lose the next election. It looks like the LGBT activists have seen the writing on the wall. They figure Justin Trudeau is going to lose pretty badly to federal Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, and as such, they want him to step down and turn over the reins to a successor who might have a better shot of winning against the Conservatives whenever the next election is, sometime before October of 2025. And you can understand their panic because Trudeau has basically handed them everything that they want for a decade. He has been the first Canadian Prime Minister to attend Pride parades. He's poured millions of dollars into funding various LGBT initiatives in Canada. Tens of millions of taxpayer dollars have gone to essentially fund an activist movement that's been transforming our country. Under Trudeau, the LGBT movement has a vice grip on Canadian institutions. And so you could understand if Trudeau might expect a little bit of gratitude from the LGBT movement after all that he's done for them. And he really has gone above and beyond. I think the LGBT movement is one of the few things Trudeau has ever been faithful to. And as one of my friends put it on Twitter, he's probably thinking A2 LGBTQ right about now. So let me quote to you from the CTV story because it really is amusing. As Prime Minister Justin Trudeau digs in his heels and pledges to stay on as Liberal leader despite dwindling public support, some LGBTQ2S+ activists say he is putting queer and gender diverse people at risk. Queer advocates say a Conservative government led by Pierre Poilievre would be dangerous for LGBTQ2S+ Canadians, and some are pushing for Trudeau to step aside to give the Liberals a better chance of winning the next election, which must be held before October 2025. Now, there's a really incredible irony. That's why I wanted to cover this story, because LGBT activists, and this very much includes Trudeau himself, have constantly used incredibly hyperbolic language to insist that anything and everything that opposes the LGBT agenda is a danger or a risk to actual lives. We see this all the time. If you oppose gender ideology in schools, you're threatening the lives of trans-identified kids. If you oppose funding various LGBT initiatives, we're immediately accused of putting LGBT people at danger, at risk. We're saying that this is a threat to their lives, to their well-being. One of the most consistent tropes the transgender movement has used is that if you do not affirm any form of gender dysphoria, from being a tomboy to wondering whether or not your kindergarten teacher was right when she told you that you could be any gender that you want, if you do not affirm any feeling that a child expresses, you are placing them at an active risk for suicide. Now, this myth was always garbage, and it is starting to break in some places. In the UK, actually, a transgender organization sued the government to put an end to their ban on puberty blockers. And what the Labour government, this is a left-wing government, did instead was they commissioned a study into whether or not suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts were going up since the implementation of puberty blockers. They found that not only was this not the case, but they actually stated that the transgender movement was being incredibly irresponsible in the way that they talk about suicide, because suicidal ideation actually can become a mass psychosis, can become contagious. And so it is transgender activists who are posing a direct danger to confused kids by constantly referencing suicide. So what's really ironic here is that the weaponized language of putting LGBT people at risk is now being directed directly at Justin Trudeau by the LGBT activists. And this must be a really bitter pill for him to swallow, because he's been saying stuff like this for years. Now they're basically telling him if he stays Prime Minister, he is, quote, putting queer and gender diverse people at risk. So here's some more from that article. The executive director of the Newfoundland and Labrador Queer Research Initiative, probably funded by us, said she's concerned about the potential harm of a Conservative government for queer Canadians. She pointed to Poilievre's comment saying minors should not have access to puberty blockers, again, the position of European medical establishments everywhere, and transgender athletes should be barred from women's sports and change rooms. The normalization of this rhetoric is dangerous, and so are the potential policies that he could implement, Sarah Worthman said. Meanwhile, Worthman said that the Liberals would have a better chance of beating the Conservatives if they switched Trudeau out for someone new, but she didn't say whom. Worthman added that the federal NDP, led by Jagmeet Singh, could also benefit from a change in leadership. That probably has nothing to do with the LGBT thing. That's just a side comment because everybody's noticed at this point. Either Jagmeet Singh is so terrible at politics that he doesn't know what he's doing, or he's an incredibly cynical grifter. Neither of those analyses are very beneficial to him. The Conservatives did not provide someone for comment to CTV, but instead sent an email with a series of transcribed answers that Poilievre gave to journalists between June 2023 and February 2024 on LGBTQ issues. And I was actually a bit encouraged by this because the answers included Poilievre reiterating that Canada should offer refuge to persecuted people around the world, but also saying in February that female spaces should be exclusively for females, not for biological males. This used to be very, very common sense, but I'm glad that Poilievre reiterated this because I don't trust the Conservative Party on social issues farther than I can throw them. And when asked if transgender women, that is biological males, should be barred from women's sports or be admitted into women's shelters or prisons, Poilievre also opposes that. And at the time, the Tory leader also said he is opposed to youth under 18 taking puberty blockers, medicine, CTV calls it, often used by trans-identified youth to temporarily suppress the hormones that cause puberty. Again, there's a whole bunch of lies directly in that paragraph. I won't deal with them all individually now. Final quote from the article here. Helen Kennedy, Executive Director of Egali Canada, it's one of the worst groups in the country, said there has been a marked rise in hateful rhetoric about LGBTQ plus whatever people in Canadian politics, which has left, quote, members of our community to feel like they're being hunted at the moment by their own political leaders. Certainly not every conservative is anti-LGBTQ, presumably Poilievre's dad, who's gay, isn't. But right at the moment, it appears that the leader of the federal Conservative Party is using this as a vote getter, she said. It's really based on political opportunism, and it's really alarming. Now, consider for a minute, there's so much in this story. That's why I wanted to quote some sections of this article, because consider how paranoid and conspiratorial you have to be to believe in a country where the leader of every single major political party feels the need to genuflect to the LGBT movement, that the LGBT people are being hunted by these leaders. It actually defies belief and certainly defies reason. If there's any hunting going on, it's politicians who are desperate with a photo op for some drag queen so they can prove to the CBC they're not bigots. That's the only hunting we see going on in this country. But right now, as I mentioned earlier, the LGBT movement owns the Canadian establishment, lock, stock, and barrel. Even Poilievre's position on sex changes for minors is literally to the left of the UK party, the Labour Party, which is progressive in every single way. So in one article, you have a whole bunch of things going on here. One, you have the LGBT movement stabbing Justin Trudeau in the back, which is genuinely hilarious. And they even take a little poke at Jagmeet just for good measure. Then you have them claiming that if Trudeau doesn't resign, he's placing queer and gender diverse Canadians at risk. So he is threatening the lives of LGBT people if he does not decide to take a walk in the snow and resign as Prime Minister. Then, despite the fact that this paranoid movement literally controls every major institution in the country, every single major institution is controlled by them, and their movement is actually funded by the government. So a movement that's astroturfed with taxpayer dollars from the government that never shuts up about how much it cares about the LGBT movement, that hosts massive parades where nude gay men can walk through the downtown Toronto in front of kids. And that's fine because it's LGBT people who are doing this. This movement is being hunted down by our political leaders. A serious press would have, pushed back on that. So how exactly are they hunting you down? When we see politicians hunting down LGBT people, it's usually for a photo op because they desperately want everybody to know that they have the approval of all of the groups that the government itself is funding. And so this is incredibly ludicrous. So what kind of Canada do the LGBT activists actually want to preserve? This is a question worth asking because despite the fact that Canada was one of the first Western countries to redefine marriage, one of the first countries to accept a lot of the LGBT agenda, things have changed a lot under Trudeau. We've seen a lot of policies creep in that nobody voted for, that nobody approved of. We have the systems in public schools changing where kids are being socially transitioned without their parents' knowledge, where parents are being reported to child services if they object to this, where drag queens are reading to kids even in schools, and the Toronto District School Board actually claimed that it was a human right for kids to be exposed to drag queens. This stuff has happened very, very quickly, and this stuff has become deeply entrenched into our public institutions in the past 9 years. And so a deeply reported story from the National Post that was published on September 3, titled "Ontario School Hid Girls Transitioned," called CAS, that's Child Services, on parents questioning trans identity, gives us some idea. Now, one of the reasons I think that this story is worth a close look is because we see a couple of things going on here. The bait and switch is that what Justin Trudeau and the LGBT movement do, I repeat myself there, but when you have the LGBT supporting politicians and the LGBT movement, is they change everything without asking anybody. And then if people notice what they're up to and point this out, then suddenly we're bigots, we're challenging norms, we're changing everything. So if you notice that everything is changing, if you dare to point out that the things that are happening now were not happening 5 years ago, were not happening 10 years ago, then you are the problem. It's a really, really neat trick. And it's how Trudeau can say that Poilievre is going to create some horrifying hellscape Canada for rolling back stuff that's been with us as long as, 2017. So this story gives us an idea of just how deep the rot of gender ideology has sunk into our institutions and how much of an active danger it actually poses to your kids if you do send them to a Canadian public school. So let me quote a quote from the article, because there's a lot of important points here. Julie's life turned upside down after COVID hit. Barely 10 years old and physically isolated from much of the world, in early 2021, she installed TikTok and began spending hours online, falling down social media rabbit holes. She eventually discovered the LGBTQ+ community and started questioning her identity. That's an important point there. Every major thinker and author on this issue says that most kids are being exposed to gender ideology either at public school or on the internet. If you give your kids access to the internet, you are giving them access to gender ideology. There are people online who would like to speak to your children about these issues. And if you kind of understand the internet as a digital public square with lots of dark alleys, if you don't have guardrails over the internet, if you don't have limitations, if you're letting them go on the internet, they're going to find this stuff. Quote, "At first it was only my sexuality, pansexual, lesbian, maybe bi," Julie later wrote in a personal essay. "Eventually, videos asking viewers whether they were anxious and uncomfortable in their own bodies triggered her to question her gender identity. Transgender activists were actively posting videos about safe breast binding." That's when you actually you wrap something around your chest to flatten your breasts. It has horrifying health implications. But this is something that trans activists promote so people can present as male. It flattens your chest, so if you're female, you can appear as male. And how euphoric testosterone makes you feel and how it makes all of your problems suddenly disappear. "The more I was brainwashed by these videos, the more I started to resonate with them," Julie wrote. She began identifying privately as non-binary in 2021 at the start of grade 5. Grade 5. She came out to her class at the beginning of 2022. Again, non-binary is kind of this middle category for those of you who know what that is. It essentially means that you reject the binary of there being only male or female, and you just identify as outside the binary. So you identify as neither male nor female. Most of them want people to use the pronouns they when referring to non-binary. And again, this is an accepted identity by all of our public institutions. With the help of a teacher in York Catholic District School Board, I hope everybody heard the Catholic District School Board, her parents were kept in the dark about her use of they-them pronouns and a new masculinized name in the classroom. Only in June 2022 did her parents learn what was quietly going on in school, and when they objected and asked school leaders to include them in conversations about their daughter, the school called the Children's Aid Society, CAS, which investigated the family. So these parents wanted to know what was going on with their daughter, who was in grade 5, was changing her name, changing her pronouns, using an identity that stated she was neither male nor female. And when the parents asked to be involved in these decisions, the Catholic District School Board called child services on them to get them investigated. Julia's mother, Christina, said, "It was a horrible time for me as a parent because so much was happening behind my back. I didn't know for a long while about many things that were happening. I suspected that something was really wrong." Now, this is a parent's worst nightmare, but this is happening in both Canada and it's happening right across the US. I have gotten countless messages from parents who have discovered too late that their children have been exposed to gender ideology, again, usually at school or on the internet, and whose children are already firmly entrenched in a new identity that's being encouraged by teachers who are referring them to school therapists who affirm their new gender identity and will get them to doctors who can begin them on puberty blockers. I have talked to mothers and fathers who are absolutely desperate because they are watching their children physiologically disintegrate in front of them through these sex change treatments. But every single force of the state is against them. So everybody's aligned against them. The principal, the teachers, the school therapist, the affirming psychiatrists that they're brought to. And then the government itself is in most cases not on the parent side. These parents are being physically prevented from attempting to speak to their children about this new ideology that many parents weren't even aware of, pardon me. I was at a pro-life presentation recently where one, again, Catholic mother came up to me and said 2 of her 8 kids now identified as transgender, and there was almost nothing that she could do because if you watch the influencer videos on TikTok and on YouTube especially, these transgender influencers will actually explain how you need to cut your parents out if they object to your new identity. That if they use your dead name, which is the name that your parents gave you at birth, that these people are actively dangerous to your health. Your parents are dangerous to you and you should cut them out. And the transgender influencers say that instead you should embrace your glitter family. And your glitter family is what they refer to the LGBT community. So we'll take you out of your real family, we'll put you in a glitter family, and in the meantime, we can get you everything you need. There's a black market online for testosterone. You can buy something called Packers, which is fake male genitalia that girls can wear in their underwear so they can pass as male. Chest binders, which can often permanently damage the breast and leave them looking like deflated balloons, as Abigail Schreier put it in her book, Irreversible Damage. This is horrifying stuff. And keep in mind, there's another implication going on here, a very radical one that rarely gets referenced. According to Trudeau's LGBT activists, it's parents, not state employees, who pose an active danger to their kids. Think about it. Parents love their kids. And instead, parents who want to be involved with our grade 5 daughter's life-changing decisions, again, grade 5, guys, grade 5, and they get the child services called on them as if they're abusive parents. Rachel Notley, the former premier of Alberta, did this. Dr. Chris Wells, who we discussed in the previous episode and is now a senator, did this. What they're doing is they're saying that parents who do not believe the gender ideology that's been rejected by the UK, rejected by all these different countries and medical establishments, if you do not believe in that, you pose an active threat to your children, and maybe your kids should get taken away from you. And kids are getting taken away from parents in both Canada and the US because of this. Here's another excerpt. Christina said at the time she was unaware that her daughter's school board permitted children to socially transition without the consent or knowledge of their guardians. I want to emphasize here again, the National Health Service in the UK, not a far-right organization, this is the socialized healthcare system, has said that social transitioning, which is changing your name, changing your pronouns, changing the way you present at school, is psychologically dangerous for children. Trudeau likes to claim that it's far-right American propaganda from, guys like Ben Shapiro, who are planting these doubts about gender ideology in the minds of Canadians. Now, the National Health Service of the UK says this. Ontario's education minister refused to comment on this case, but a spokesperson said that schools should have policies that keep secrets from their parents. Well, if the schools should have these policies, perhaps the education minister could look at laws that have been passed in other provinces and consider doing that for Ontario. We have been made aware that the Children's Aid Society has been involved in this case, but it would be inappropriate to comment on this individual situation, said a spokesperson of the ministry. However, I can reaffirm the government's clear expectation, although not law because they're cowards, that parents be fully involved and engaged by school boards in the life of their children. We expect transparency between all parties to ensure the safety and success of every child. That's garbage because the policies in many of these schools are not to tell the parents. Those are policies. So transparency is against school policy in most cases. And again, this was a Catholic school board that we're talking about here. The Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies, a group which represents the majority of children's aid societies in the province, said in a statement that while they could not discuss the specifics of Julie's case in general, they had observed an uptick in gender identity-related calls in recent years. Again, that's important because basically what it means is that the Children's Aid Society, which exists to protect the welfare of children when they have genuinely abusive parents, is being called about parents who don't want their girl to become a little boy or their little boy to become a girl, which is impossible, but surgeons will ruin them in the attempt. Julie's interactions with medical professionals throughout this time were overshadowed by gender-affirming advice, Julie said. When she was just 11, her family doctor assured her that binding is perfectly healthy and asked her if she was interested in learning about puberty blockers. At age 11, a psychiatrist warned her parents, here's the blood libel again, that if they did not affirm her trans identity, she could kill herself, Julie said. Again, this is the emotional blackmail that trans activists use on parents. And ironically, this is kind of the blackmail now that LGBT activists are leveling at Trudeau. That if he stays Prime Minister, he places, queer and gender diverse Canadians at active risk. Here's what Julie wrote in her essay. At that age, I can't make a conscious decision about medical interventions with an extremely high risk of life-threatening side effects that could make me unable to ever conceive a child, she wrote. All accepted that I'm a boy and never tried to dig up any underlying problem that might be causing these suicidal ideations. But the school placed several calls to CAS over the months, resulting in at least 5 visits to the family home. Okay, this is in Canada. You have the Children's Aid Service visiting a family home to check to see if a little girl was safe because the school was affirming that she was actually a boy or non-binary. The doctor was telling her that she could bind her chest and get put on puberty blockers, which are illegal to use for minors in the UK now. And these parents were treated like they were the ones who pose a danger to their child. Earlier this year, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick all announced a new disclosure policy now requiring parental consent for children transitioning at schools. I've been reporting on that story regularly at thebridgehead.ca as it unfolds. In Alberta, any child under 16 who wishes to transition at school needs permission. Parents of students over 16, will be notified, but consent is not needed. So how did Julie get out of this mess? Julie's life turned a corner in November 2023 when her father brought a copy of Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters by Abigail Schreier. This book explains that many young girls experience rapid onset gender dysphoria as a result of social contagion. Julie's father bought the book for himself and warned Julie that she wouldn't be able to understand it and might be triggered by it. Although she thought the book was transphobic, she decided to read it out of curiosity. After reading about detransitioners and how they came to identify as transgender, I understood I was heading in the wrong direction. I needed to turn around before I hurt my loved ones or myself, she wrote. Soon after, she ditched the chest binder and began reverting to her female identity, or more accurately, recognizing that she is in fact female. However, again, another important point here, the stream of applause and support she'd received after initially identifying as non-binary and then as trans was nowhere to be seen after desisting, she said. When we announced she wants to go back to female pronouns, everyone kept on asking, "Are you sure? Are you sure you don't want to transition?" They weren't asking, "Are you sure?" when she said that she was non-binary or male, but they're asking, "Are you sure?" when she wanted to recognize that she was female. This is incredibly insane stuff. Before Julie cut in, they were actually asked, "Are you sure your parents are not pushing this on you? Are you sure your parents are not pushing this on you?" Now, there's been a bunch of articles that have come out pretty recently from the Daily Mail in which mothers reveal that huge percentages of classes are identifying as anything but heterosexual and anything but the sex that they actually are. Why? Because it's considered boring. One 10-year-old girl in the UK told her mom, "It's boring to be straight. Everybody's identifying as something." Why? Because the school system celebrates every identity except for your actual identity. Whatever gender costume that you want to put on, whatever surgeries you want to do with yourself, they no longer just celebrate your normal, healthy body. They celebrate these new identities. And so this is why a lot of lonely kids will find themselves to become popular overnight just by choosing to adopt a different identity. So Juliet's now getting appropriate mental health work. Over the summer, she got a open water scuba certificate, restocked her wardrobe, and made friends at a Christian overnight camp. And the article ends on a high note. "I really enjoyed it," she said, "and I finally felt truly at peace with my identity." So that story is important to follow up the story on LGBT activists and the Justin Trudeau Ides of March, because the Canada that has emerged under Justin Trudeau has been truly dystopian. Just to lay it out in very clear language, if your kids go to a public school, they'll be introduced to a gender identity, or gender ideology, pardon me. If they decide to identify as a different identity, and there's more than 72 different genders that you can pick from at this point, the school will not only assist that, but will keep it a secret from the parents. And if the parents object, if the parents ask questions, they will actually call child services to get the government involved and essentially accuse parents of being a danger to their kids, accuse these parents of genuinely being abusive. So where is this headed? Well, we've already seen human rights commissions in Canada weigh in on the side of the transgender movement. Jordan Peterson actually got famous for refusing to use so-called preferred pronouns in public. And we kind of see a clampdown on freedom of speech, a clampdown on parental rights. Our freedom to actually articulate our beliefs, to be happy and healthy, has shrunk enormously under Trudeau's Canada. And where could we be headed? Somewhere like Ireland. So watch this clip for a minute.
Burke has broken no law. He has broken no law.
I have a right to my job. I have a right to work here.
He has a right.
I have a right to be here. And
You're arresting
not
him.
to tell students they need to tell puberty blockers.
You're arresting him because he won't endorse transgender ideology.
Shame on you. Shame on you.
Shame on you, man.
That was Enoch Burke. He's a teacher at the center of a row, as the Irish media put it, over a transgender student. He's been sent to prison now for a third time by a Dublin court. Why? He's a Christian teacher, and he said he would not refer to a student identifying as a different gender by their transgender identity. That because of his faith, he had to recognize reality, that it was not kind or compassionate to refer to a confused gender dysphoric student by a chosen identity rather than recognizing reality. And so he was arrested by Irish police at Wilson's Hospital School in County Westmeath last week. That's the clip you just saw. After refusing to abide by a court order instructing him to stay away from the school, stay away from his job, because he refused to affirm gender ideology. The school board has now dismissed Burke from his post after he refused to use preferred pronouns. He was brought to the High Court in Dublin, where a judge ruled that he was to be returned to Mountjoy Prison, where he's already been twice as a result of his refusal to accept gender identity. Burke accurately accused the court of denying him his religious rights, which included his belief in two genders, male and female, and told the judge this is a mockery of justice. Burke was suspended by Wilson's Hospital School in August 2022. I covered the story at the time after a public confrontation with the then principal because the religious teacher had objected to using a new name and the they pronoun of a student who wanted to change gender. So, to tie this all back together, in Canada, in increasingly woke countries like Ireland, the LGBT movement essentially owns the establishment. Their policies, their version of language now dominates the medical institutions. It dominates every major political party, even those parties that are slowly starting to realize that just maybe all these transgender treatments that we've been embarking on are the biggest medical scandal since eugenics. And despite that, despite all of this happening, you've got, in some countries, you've got a teacher being put in jail for not using preferred pronouns. We have kids who are being taken away from their parents because their parents question gender ideology. We have teachers and principals accusing parents of being abusive and dangerous simply for wanting the best for their kids when they're age 10 or 11. This is the Canada that we live in. This is a Canada that's actively becoming a dangerous place for Christians to express their beliefs, and certainly a danger to children going to the public school where confusion is introduced, encouraged, and then affirmed. And yet, LGBT activists are so paranoid that they claim that they are being hunted, their words not mine, by our political leaders, and that Trudeau needs to step down because he might actually put LGBT identifying people at active risk if he doesn't. First part of the story, kind of funny. The fact that Justin Trudeau is being accused by the LGBT movement that he's funding with our tax dollars of being possibly an active threat to LGBT people if he refuses to resign as Prime Minister, that's pretty hilarious. It is the best Ides of March that I have ever seen, the A2 LGBTQ. But the reality is that the reverse is true, that the LGBT movement is increasingly posing a genuine physical danger to the children that it indoctrinates, a danger to the parents who only want the best for their children. And so if we want things to change, Trudeau absolutely has to go, but we also need to call out the lies that the LGBT movement is saying. We need to do so consistently, we need to do so loudly, and we need to do so that people hear us, because this situation could get a lot worse. Thanks everyone for watching that clip. If you'd like to check out our content on other platforms, you can find us on Rumble, Spotify, iTunes, or wherever else you get your content. Be sure to like and subscribe to this channel and spread the clip around if you like the content. Thanks so much.